For those of you who don't know, I'm the Senior Service Hydrologist for the National Weather Service. My contact information is going to be at the end if you do have any questions. So today we'll do a quick review of our FIM services that are now publicly available. We're also going to do a demo of the GIS viewer where you can actually view these flood inundation map services. We're also going to do a demo of the Inform viewer as well, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then we'll open this up for questions. We currently have an hour and a half designated for this webinar. I don't think we'll take that entire time, but I did want to make sure that we had enough time for questions. So for those of you who remember back in the initial trainings that we had done, I just wanted to remind you that the National Weather Service is still producing the AHAPS hydrographs at our 3,600 locations across the country. So those are not going away. Those hydrographs are still very much in play and they're still going to be very much a part of your decision-making process. But now we're going to be supplementing our water prediction capabilities with the National Water Model that's being produced by the National Water Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This basically means that we can now provide forecast services to approximately 2.7 million forecast points across the country. This is an extremely exciting time. So what does this mean for you? This means that if you don't have a forecast point in your county, or if you only have 1 or 2 forecast points in your county, we are now able to provide forecast services to the majority of the rivers, creeks, bayous, tributaries in your county to give you some sort of guidance for hydrologic prediction, which is exciting. It is quite overwhelming to see a lot of the information that comes out of the National Water Model. So it is going to be a learning curve with how we incorporate this into operations. But one of the biggest things that we can take away from the National Water Model are the new flood inundation map services that are being provided. And we're going to talk about that for in just a second. So with regards to flood inundation maps, so basically this is putting water on a map, showing you what the forecast is and what are the potential impacts from that forecast. So with regards to flood inundation mapping, the National Weather Service has provided flood inundation mapping services for years at select river forecast points across the country. You can see that on this the screen here with all the little blue dots. So we basically have 200 inundation maps at forecast points across the country. These are based off of engineering scaled hydraulic models. These are our gold standard flood inundation maps. And these are still available for you to use in planning purposes as well as response purposes as well. But you can see we're quite limited on the availability of these inundation maps that are currently available. There are only 33 in Texas and only 8 in our service area within Houston, Galveston. So this covers approximately about 1,000 miles of service across the country. But with the National Water Model, we are now able to expand those services and be able to provide additional flood inundation map services for our partners. So before we dive into the different types of FIM services that are going to be available, I wanted to make sure that I address the implementation plan. So first off, here's a map of the country. The areas in green are where we are starting our implementation, where we're basically serving 10% of the nation with flood inundation mapping services starting on October 1. So we were mandated by Congress to provide flood inundation maps to 10% of the nation. By October 1, we turned on these services as of yesterday. So those services are now publicly available in the areas highlighted in green. We're going to expand those services to 30% of the nation by October of 2024, so next year, and then 60% by 2025, and then the rest of the country by 2026. So what does this mean for you all? So in Texas, the majority or a lot of Texas is covered in that first 10%, but the areas that do not currently have flood inundation map services available within this 10% would not see flood inundation mapping capabilities until October of 2025. So if you do get questions from folks out west or down in Brownsville, they would expect to get these services in the next 2 years. So what exactly are these new FIM services? We've talked about this in all the training leading up to this. I just kind of want to give you a little refresher. So we have those AHAPs, flood inundation maps, that have already been made available. Those are static maps. Those have been pre-run. Those are the gold standard, the hydraulic models, the hydraulic model-based maps. So you're still going to have those in your toolbox, but what we're adding are dynamic flood extent maps, which means they're generated with the latest forecast information. So these are run real time. So the first service that's going to be made available, or that is made available now as of yesterday, is the River Forecast Center Max Inundation Extent, or the River Forecast Center Flood Maps. So those are basically what is the flood extent expected to be, the max flood extent over the next 5 days. These will be available approximately about 45 minutes after the official forecast is issued. So when the River Forecast Center issues a hydrograph, you would expect 45 minutes later to get an inundation map that's showing the potential impacts based off of that hydrograph. When the RFC goes to update that hydrograph every 6 hours in a flood event, you would expect to get an updated flood inundation map every 45 minutes after those updates. The next dynamic service is the National Water Model 5-day max inundation extent, or the National Water Model 5-day flood map. This is basically showing you the raw modeled forecast in terms of a flood extent map. These are based off of the global forecast system, the GFS meteorological inputs. So there is some uncertainty regarding how well the output would be in comparison to what we're actually forecast, but it does give us a little bit of guidance of where we could expect hydrologic issues along all of our national water model domain. So that includes large rivers and smaller creeks, streams, and tributaries. So these are for your non-forecast point locations. And then the last service that's being made available is the National Water Model Analysis and a Simulation Inundation Extent, or flood map. This is basically showing you a flood extent of the latest analysis. So this is not taking into consideration forecasted rainfall. This is taking into consideration observed stream flows as well as the analysis over the past hour. So this is a good what is currently being flooded, as well as adding in what additional flooding could we expect, whether that's coming from the National Water Model or from the River Forecast Center. Now, come the spring of 2024, we're going to add a service, which is the National Weather Service Flood Categorical Hand FIM libraries. Those are also known as CAT FIM. These are basically flood extent maps that are based off of the minor, moderate, and major flood categories at our forecast points. So those maps will supplement the areas that we don't have AHAPS FIM libraries. And these would be basically run as a static FIM that would be available to you prior to an event. So this would just be another tool in the toolbox. When the service is close to being released, we'll do an additional FIM training on this specific type of FIM, but I wanted to make sure you were aware that that service is coming around the corner. Okay, so all of this sounds great, and we're excited to share this information with you all. I do want to make sure I caveat with some limitations of these flood extent maps. So the first limitation, of course, is that these only show extent. So this is not going to show you depth, but again, as we've talked about in our FIM training, just because you don't have depth doesn't mean that that's not going to be useful to you in your decision-making process. It just might not be able to give you all of the answers that you need, but it still is useful information as you're going through making decisions regarding preparing for placement of resources or doing your response on targeted evacuations or high water rescues and such. Another limitation is that these are based off of a 10-meter digital elevation model. So it's not using the latest LiDAR. It is using a more approximate method for the mapping component. So this might not show as refined output in some locations. So it just needs to be used with a little bit more uncertainty. Still useful, but just need to make sure that you're aware that it's not using the latest LiDAR. It's using some simplified physics. So where you have hydraulic modeled flood inundation maps, those are going to take priority because basically these are just kind of showing you a simplified version of what we think is happening hydrologically across our area. So these are a good first guess, but where we have more refined hydraulic models and flood inundation maps, those should take precedent in your decision-making process. Now, the national water model versions are limited to their quantitative precipitation forecast, so how much rainfall is being incorporated as an input. That's that 5-day national water model flood extent map. So basically just knowing that the output is based off of a rainfall forecast, and that can inherently change. The biggest takeaway with this is that you just want to make sure that you are staying connected to what the National Weather Service office is sharing with regards to the actual forecast and how that might play into the performance of these flood extent maps. The national water model versions, basically the flow is not based off of a human forecast. So there is some uncertainty with it being an automated product, but that doesn't mean, again, that it can't be useful. We just have to take it with a little bit of uncertainty. And the last piece is that the coastal use is limited. There is a coastal emission zone, and I'll show that on the viewer. We do have to be very careful with using these maps in the coastal emission zone. There is the total water level forecast that's going to be coming in the next year. It's not currently publicly available because it's still going through a fully evaluation calibration process. But that is something that we do recognize as a limitation and that we are working on to come up with a solution for our coastal zones. So how would you use these FIMs before, during, and after a flood event? We've practiced this in our external tabletop exercise that we did back in June, but I just kind of wanted to highlight some quick usage of these different flood inundation map services because I'm sure that this is a little overwhelming to hear that there's all these different flood extent maps coming at you. So to start, if you are in the preparedness phase, you're in the blue sky days, you're days 4 through 7 ahead of an event, you would be using the AHAPs, flood inundation maps, and eventually the categorical FIMs to help you with your planning purposes, help you figure out where you could potentially be pre-positioning resources if you needed to, but those would help in your mitigation plans. As you get closer to an actual event where you're starting to receive the rainfall forecast and you're starting to get confidence levels from your forecast office, and you're starting to kind of anticipate what are some of the expected impacts, you would still be using your AHAPs, flood inundation maps. You'd be using the categorical FIMs when those are available next in the spring. But you would also have your River Forecast Center flood inundation maps as well. So as long as you have a hydrograph from the River Forecast Center, you should have a flood inundation map alongside that, as long as it's showing it's in flood. Now, you can start using the National Water Model flood inundation maps from the 5-day FIM just to kind of get an idea of what the GFS rainfall is showing. But we would be very hesitant to using it too far in advance because, again, it is using 5 days worth of rainfall, which can tend to overestimate some of the flooding or can overrepresent where you have flooding concerns, especially if the rainfall forecast shifts. So we tend to reserve the National Water Model flood extent maps for the flood duration timeframe. So basically, when you're trying to assess where you currently have flooding, the National Water Model Analysis in a Simulation FIM would be a great tool. And then also where you might have additional flooding, you would be using the River Forecast Center flood extent maps in conjunction with the National Water Model 5-day flood extent maps. We do understand that a lot of times in the flood itself, there's a lot going on. We understand that, there are some limitations with resources available. And so we know that there's going to be a learning curve with this and trying to fit this into your battle rhythm, but we're just trying to help you understand where some of these flood inundation maps would fit into your planning process and response process. And as you're wrapping up the flood itself in the post-flood event timeframe, This is where we would be collecting high water marks, we'd be doing some damage assessments. This would be extremely useful time to use that national water model analysis in a simulation FIM, where we're currently showing what the latest analysis is, as well as you could also compare those with the AHAPS flood inundation maps or the categorical flood inundation maps. So these are just some examples of how you could utilize these FIM services in the different time frames of an event. This is not necessarily how you have to do it. There are going to be lessons learned. We're going to continue to do training with you, tabletop exercises, to see how we can best utilize these services to help you make better decisions. I did get this question after some of our training earlier this year, and it was basically, when can I expect update times for these flood inundation map services? So for the analysis and a simulation FIM, that's the latest analysis and shows the current conditions. There's a model latency time of 45 minutes and a processing time of 5 minutes. So you would expect to get an update every 50 minutes, all right? For the National Water Model 5-day FIM, these are run every 6 hours. There's a latency time of 6 hours and 25 minutes, processing time of 8 minutes. So you would expect to have an update on the National Water Model 5-day FIM every 6.5 hours approximately. And then the River Forecast Center 5-day FIM, and I mentioned this earlier, this is basically a 45-minute to up to an hour delay for after all of the RFC forecasts have been issued. So I would anticipate closer to the 45-minute latency time for that. Now, we don't expect you to be sitting in your EOC or your operations location and trying to review all of these flood inundation map services and make decisions without any additional support. So we want to make sure that we can reassure you that we are here to help. We are going to be looking at this from the National Weather Service stance. We're going to be fully evaluating the accuracy of these inundation maps, whether that's at the local level, at the river forecast level, or at the national level at the National Water Center. These are going to be evaluated on all levels for accuracy and confidence. And we're also planning to incorporate this into our impact decision support services. So right out of the gate, we're going to be doing our best with trying to convey critical information from these flood extent maps when we get into an event. But we know that this is going to need to evolve over time. So as we go through an event, the public services are going to be made available to you. So you would have access to them to view them in your own time and in your own environment. But we would also plan to try to supplement those public services with baseline impact-based decision support services. So when you get an email from our office, theoretically, we would try to address inundation maps in that email in a general sense, saying that we are evaluating them. Be careful using the National Water Model flood inundation map because it's using the GFS, or, you know, we're honing in on this location because we think that the National Water Model is doing well. So kind of giving you some guidance on how you could potentially use these inundation maps, but more in a general sense. As an event unfolds, we would hopefully be able to start providing targeted IDSS, which is where we can start potentially doing some screen shares with our partners, sending targeted emails and graphics, highlighting specific impacts along rivers, creeks, or bayous, and kind of targeting specific needs of our partners. But if we needed to, we could also provide fully integrated impact-based decision services, which would basically tailor all of the content to your specific needs. Now, of course, the most common impact decision support services that we would provide is that baseline and targeted IDSS. We talked about this in our external tabletop exercise of what this would look like. Of course, this is all going to evolve as we go throughout events. The biggest thing that we're going to need from you is feedback on what's working, what's not working, and where we can make improvements for the next event. One thing I do want to mention is that flood inundation maps, especially from the National Weather Service and these National Water Model flood extent maps, should be used for neighborhood level or larger domain scales. And this is to account for a lot of those limitations that I've brought up for forecast and mapping uncertainties. And if you have any questions regarding the usage of these flood inundation maps, we are here to help support your questions and decision-making process. Okay, so now that we've done a quick review of those services, what I would like to do is take a minute to walk you through how you would view these services in your own environment. So the National Weather Service GIS Viewer is available, and it is linked in our PNS, which is at the top of our webpage. It's also linked in the email that I sent yesterday, and it will also be linked in a follow-up email for this webinar with the recorded link to this webinar. There are also instructions for how to look at inundation maps on this viewer that I will attach as well. So you should have all the information you need following this webinar. But I did want to take a minute just to kind of walk you through it. So when you pull up the viewer, this is what you would see. You, of course, would want to kind of zoom into your local area. And you give it a minute to load and kind of let everything kind of catch up. The first thing you would do is you would want to select the layers button up on the top right hand side of the screen. And if you click on that, there are going to be many layers that are going to pull up. The first layer that you would want to look at, and there's a lot of defaults. You can clear all layers if that's a lot for you to look at, or you can leave it up. It's completely up to you. But if you want to see the inundation maps, you're going to have to scroll down, and it's underneath the radar products listing, and it's the flood inundation maps FIM experimental. You would expand that, and you would see that there are the 3 FIM services that we talked about. The latest analysis, that's the analysis and the simulation flood inundation map, the RFC 5-day max forecast, and the National Water Model 5-day max forecast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn them all on just so that you can see that basically when you pull it up, there's not much to see. You have to zoom in to be able to see the actual scale because it's set to a zoom level 18 plus. So we know that we don't have ongoing flooding in Texas right now. So I am going to take us up into Pennsylvania just so that you can kind of see where we might have an example, and hopefully I can find it relatively easily so you can see what it would look like. And if we can't find it, that's okay. You can challenge yourself to go and look and see if you can find it later. All right, and it's going to take a minute to kind of load everything. Now, the beauty of this viewer is that you can also add your own layers in here. And I'm not able to find the FIM that I had picked out, which is okay. I will also try to look, see here. And it is a 5-day one. All right. Even though we can't find it now, see, this is good though. That means we don't have a lot of flooding going on, which is great. Even though we cannot find an example right now, you would basically see something similar to basically what you saw in the in all of the training that we had before. Let's see here. I think I threw in an example. So you would basically see something like this, where you would have the blue areas showing the flood extent. Let's see, I think this was Delaware tap. I might be able to show you. Type in Delaware tap. Let's see if anything shows up when we do that. And if you look down here at the bottom, there's this red bar. This is a disclaimer that shows this experimental map represents the National Weather Service's best approximation of inundation extent based upon modeled river discharge. So that is a disclaimer that we want to make sure you and any of our other partners are aware of and are using, especially if you're going to be sharing this information out with the public. that people are aware of the disclaimers that kind of follow through with this. That, they're probably not going to understand all the limitations that we've discussed, but that they do understand that there are limitations to using these extent maps. We don't want people making decisions off of these maps blindly. Okay, so when you are in here, it might prompt you to log in. A login is not required. If desired, you can create a login, which would allow you to gain access to some additional items like bookmarking specific layers. It would access to a draw tool, but it's not necessary. If you do have questions about that, please feel free to let us know. Another thing that we had mentioned was that you could add data from your own repository of layers. So you would just come up to this icon of add data, click on it, click add data, and it would allow you the opportunity to select what type of data you want to add. So if you have your own REST services, such as critical infrastructure layers, you can click on that. You would just give it a title, put the URL and the type of layer that it is. If you have questions about this, please feel free to let us know. But this is another opportunity for you to add basically information that would help you make decisions on a local level or a regional level. The other thing I wanted to show you was the coastal exclusion zone or the emission zone. So you will see anywhere you see this red hatched area, that's the coastal emission zone. This is where you don't necessarily, you can't use the flood extent maps, but you need to be very careful with using the flood extent maps because we've basically deemed these areas as a coastal region where tide and surge have a big impact on the river inundation that are not being modeled here, not being accounted for. So there are going to be times where we're probably going to say, please do not use the inundation maps in the coastal emission zone, especially if we're in a surge type of scenario or we have high tides or whatnot. So that's something we would want you to be careful of. There are some companion services that you can look at on this viewer as well. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, but I want to make sure that you are aware that they're there. So you would go down to this surface forecast and outlooks, and you would expand the options and the weather prediction forecast. This is where you can overlay our rainfall forecast, depending on what time frame that you're interested in. So you could look at the cumulative precip for the next 48 hours or 72 hours, all the way up to 168 hours. This is a good tool to be able to see what the official forecast is compared to what the GFS would be showing, because the GFS is what's driving the National Water Model 5-day flood extent map. So there's a lot of options here. There's a lot of things that you can do with this viewer. This is just the water service. You can go in here, you can look at severe weather service, winter service, climate service. There are different options. So if for some reason you find yourself, not finding the tabs that you need, it might be because you're on a different service. The water service is the one that has the inundation maps available. So there are some basic user guides, some helpful pages that are available to kind of walk you through a lot of the different functionalities of this viewer that I will share with you, but I wanted to at least give you a quick demo that you could use, or at least to start you off with. So I would challenge you to go and play in this viewer, see if you could find that area where we had that flood extent map, or at least maybe keep an eye on areas across the country where, or at least in the 10% area where you could potentially see flood extent maps over the next few weeks. The other thing I wanted to do was do a quick demo of the Inform Flood Decision Support Toolbox. So this is a viewer that is supported by the USGS, FEMA, Texas Water Development Board. It has a lot of the hydraulic engineering-based flood inundation maps that are available in Texas. They also have them for other FEMA regions across the country. Right now, I just have it zoned in on Texas. So basically what you would do is these would be very similar to the AHAPS flood inundation maps. These are those static maps that would be pre-run and available to you ahead of an event or even during the event. These are those the higher quality gold standard FIMs that we would certainly recommend you look at where you have those available and use those over the National Water Model Service. So if you were to zoom in, for example, we could pick the East Fork at Cleveland or the East Fork San Jacinto River near New Caney. That's the one I'm going to pick here. When you click on it, it's going to take a second to pull up. You can see that there's an orange boundary, and that's basically showing you the extent of where they have confidence in the output from the model for this specific location. And what you would do is you would use the GUI on the right-hand side, and you would select the appropriate stage. So for example, we're forecasting 65 feet. You would click on 65 feet, which is moderate flooding, and it would pull up the flood inundation map. As you can see, if you turn on the legend, it has depth available, which is something that the National Water Model flood extent maps do not currently have. And you would be able to zoom in. You could potentially turn on the buildings layer, and it's going to give a disclaimer here, basically showing uncertainties with limitations for buildings, which is understandable. So you would zoom in and you would potentially see areas where you might have structures being flooded, where you might have potential roads being inundated, neighborhoods being cut off. So you would, in theory, utilize this tool in conjunction with the hydrographs that we're putting out from the River Forecast Center, as well as the National Water Model flood extent maps, especially in areas where you don't have forecast services or you don't have these hydraulic flood inundation maps, to help you with understanding kind of the hydrologic conditions, current and forecast, to improve your decision-making process. Again, I understand this is a lot of information. This is, again, meant to be a refresher for the training that we've done up until this point. If you have questions about this, certainly you go back to the initial trainings that we had provided, or reach out to our office. But one of the things that I wanted to make sure that you were aware of is that the Inform site here, this Flood Decision Support Toolbox, will host the National Water Model flood extent maps, those 3 services that we've talked about that are on that GIS viewer. They will host them on this webpage as well. So this would be a one-stop shop on this Flood Decision Support Toolbox to kind of see all of the hydrologic gold standard FIMs in conjunction with the National Water Model FIMs. This will be made available early next year. So that's something that you can look forward to. So in the meantime, as you're getting to learn these new services and play around with them and see how they would fit into your operations, you're going to have to flip-flop between 2 different viewers. But come early next year, we're going to be able to start seeing all of this in a one-stop shop platform. So I'm going to come back into here, and we've completed our demos. And with that, I am going to take any questions that you may have regarding these FIM services. I'm going to turn off the recording so that you can ask your questions.